The old man lived alone in the valley, yet every morning he set aside a meal for someone who never came. There was an old man who lived alone in a nameless stretch of land. Each morning he placed 2 plates on the table, though only his shadow moved about the kitchen. People said he was mad. Until one day, an 18-year-old girl was put up for sale, and no one made a bid. But the old man turned his horse around without reason. She didn't say thank you. He didn't ask why. But from that day on, folks in Gully's Hollow began whispering of a kind of kindness that had no name. And a second cup of morning coffee that, at long last, was no longer untouched. Wyatt Granger was awake before the sun had a chance to rise. He always rose earlier than the light, as if waiting for daylight to open his eyes meant the day would slip by too fast to be lived right. The morning wind slipped through the cracks in the walls, cold in the kind of way that wouldn't kill a man, but made him want to keep quiet a little longer. He stood in the dark for a long moment, one calloused hand searching for the firewood box near the stove. Every morning began like this: a log, a handful of dry straw, and a flame just strong enough to crackle in place of a greeting. The cabin had only one bedroom, a small kitchen, a dining table, and a wide porch that opened to the prairie. From the corner of that porch you could see the whole world without ever having to step outside. But the strangest thing was the wooden table out there always had 2 chairs. One of the chairs was always straighter, cleaner, no one ever sat in it. But each morning, once the water boiled, Wyatt poured 2 cups of coffee. He set the first cup down in front of his own seat to his left hand. The other he gently turned the handle outward. A small detail, almost ridiculous, but he did it as if someone might still walk out behind him and sit down. The opposite chair made no creak. It simply stood there, a silent witness. It had been years. No one had sat there since. Wyatt sat, lifted his cup. The wind carried the scent of old smoke from the northern woods. In the distance, the low murmur of buffalo echoed, like a whisper time had forgotten. Yellow grass trembled in the morning haze. Farther still, the horizon blurred like ink smeared across a letter never sent. On the table, beside the cup, lay a soft, leather-bound notebook with a frayed spine. Wyatt opened it and turned the pages with care, as though memory itself might tear if handled too fast. On the last page, a single line in tilted handwriting, gentle, soft, like the voice of someone who'd never raised it. "If someone ever comes here, don't close the door, Pa. They might not need much. Just a place less cold than the one they left." He read it slowly, not because he didn't know it by heart, but because he wanted to hear every word again, like listening to the breath of the past. Then he closed the notebook and gently stroked the worn spine, like he might have once smoothed the hair of a daughter who was no longer there. Above, the sun began to rise behind the hill. Light slanted across his shoulder, pulling his and the empty chair's shadow long over the old wooden boards. That shadow stretched all the way to the steps, touching the edge of silence he sometimes thought, no matter how long it reached, no one would ever answer. Wyatt took the final sip. The second cup stayed full, its steam still rising, untouched. He didn't pour it out. He didn't keep it either. He carried it inside, rinsed it like he always did, then came back out to wipe down the second chair with a soft rag, tapping off the dust just in case it might cling to someone's sleeve if they ever came back. The chickens began to call from the coop. He grabbed an old burlap sack, measured grain, and fed them. They ran to it, clawing at the dirt. One pecked his boot heel, then wandered off. He watched it go without scolding, without sound. By the broken fence, grass pushed through the rails, worn thin like old ribs. Wyatt walked over and fixed 2 spots where the nails had worked loose, his weathered hands needing no gloves. When he was done, he stood for a while, facing east. The sky was clear, but something in the space between earth and heaven felt still. A kind of emptiness no one could name, no one could fill, but it was there, every day. He turned back, eyes on the small house, where the wind still slipped through the roof, where the second chair had never once fallen over, where every morning he still placed the second cup, and always left the door ajar, as if someone might return. Not today, but someday. Wyatt didn't keep much. An old horse, 4 hens, and a house where the wind came and went, like an old friend who no longer bothered to knock. His ranch, if it could still be called that, sat apart from the main road, tucked behind a low-rise where the foxgrass still swayed under the harsh western sun. The horse's name was Rye. Her left hind leg was lame. She walked unevenly with the stumbling gait of an old man who'd lost his balance. But Wyatt had never left her behind. Every morning, after his cup of coffee and the daily wiping of the empty chair, he would lead Rye from the stall, settle the saddle on her back with a rhythm worn in by time, and climb up, not quickly, not slow. They always made a loop around the property line, a habit no one needed to keep anymore since there was no one left to dispute the land. The folks in town often said he should put the horse down, or at the very least trade her in for a younger one. But Wyatt would just smile, not at the words, but at the notion that people thought they understood what was worth keeping and what wasn't. On the southern rise stood a lone pine. From Rye's back, Wyatt stopped beneath it every day. There was nothing there, just the highest spot where a man could see everything. The crooked fences, the rows of onions that had dried to husks a month ago, and a roof no longer new but never once collapsed. Rye stood with her labored breath, but made no complaint. Wyatt patted her thin neck, his fingers rough, his palms dry as dust. Once he whispered to her, "We're growing old together. That's enough." On the way back, he always passed the garden out back. It had once been green with vegetables. Now only a row of yellowing onions remained, giving off a sharp, half-living scent. He didn't pull them, didn't water them evenly, but he still brought a pail of water from the well and poured it gently over the few that hadn't entirely given up, not because he thought they'd thrive, but because sometimes a man needs to keep a few things alive, just to know he hasn't learned to abandon everything. At night, he lit the stove, ate cold rice with dried meat, drank cool water from a tin cup. Then he'd sit at the edge of the table, pull open a drawer, and take out a stack of old letters, each one handwritten, the ink smudged in places where emotions had blurred the lines. There was one passage he always returned to, as though it carried a message from a part of life he'd once misplaced. If someone ever knocks, don't rush to wonder what they want. Maybe all they need is a porch wide enough not to feel small beneath it. He'd sit there, under the glow of a single oil lamp, as the night outside breathed softly through the warped wooden walls. The wind wasn't cruel, but enough to make the boards creak. A bat swept past the porch roof. The hens were asleep. Rye exhaled steadily behind the stall wall, and Wyatt stayed awake, his eyes touching nothing but the shape of his own shadow cast on the kitchen wall. By the fireplace sat a small pair of leather shoes, old, dust-covered, no longer fitting anyone, but still there, neatly placed, toes pointed to the door, as if ready to walk again, if someone stepped forward and said, "Let's go." No one ever did. But come morning, Wyatt would once again lead Rye around the land, pour water over the withering onions, set out 2 cups of coffee on the porch table, and wipe the dust from the chair no one sat in. Because sometimes what we keep isn't kept for its worth, but because we're trying not to become someone who's learned how to throw everything away. Morrow wasn't a big town. Just one main road, 2 rows of buildings facing each other, a small tin-roofed church, and a saloon that stayed open even on Sundays. But this week, the crowd was bigger than usual. The wind carried whistles, drums, and the scent of fried grease. The traveling circus had arrived. A three-tiered wagon, its paint flaking in patches of red, yellow, and blue, stood at the top of the dirt slope leading into the town square. A ragged cloth banner stretched across it, bearing the faded words, "Wild wonders of the West, strange things, unforgettable people." Wyatt had come into town to fetch a sack of coarse salt for the coming winter. He paid no mind to the crowd. Couldn't even remember the last time he'd stood in a place with more than 3 souls around him. But as he led Rye across the square, something made him stop. A cage, set apart, no curtains, no spectacle, just sitting there in the corner like something unsold and forgotten after a market day. Inside was a girl, maybe 18, eyes swollen, lips cracked. A fading bruise darkened her left cheek. Her long, dry hair was tied behind her neck with a torn strip of cloth. Her hands were bound loosely, not tight, as if whoever put her there already knew she had no strength or reason left to run. A wooden sign leaned against the bars, the words scrawled in crude black ink. Wild thing, half-blood, untamed, half-Indian, savage, unclaimed. Children ran by, tossing pebbles at the cage, giggling. A woman tapped her teacup and shook her head. A drunk cursed in words no child should hear. No one looked at her like she was a person. Wyatt stood 10 paces off. He didn't step closer, didn't turn away. The girl didn't look at anyone, but for one brief second, her eyes met his. It wasn't pleading, it wasn't hatred. It was the look of someone who had learned not to ask for rescue. Because too many had come, only to leave. It was a look without bottom, like a wound that no longer bleeds but never healed. The wind tugged at the hem of Wyatt's coat. He gripped the reins. Rye lifted her front right hoof. Behind them the crowd roared, the pipe players stumbling in rhythm. A monkey in a green dress flipped along a taut rope. Laughter, glass shattering, voices calling for delight. It was all one fever of noise, and Wyatt stood outside it. The girl stayed crouched, chin resting on her knees like her spine no longer had the will to hold her upright. Wyatt turned away, but the shadow of that cage and the emptiness in those eyes followed him all the way back to his stable door. That night the moon was thin behind clouds. He lit the stove late, not for hunger, but because his hands needed something to do. Rye lay quietly against the stall. The chickens had nodded off in a line. The wind slipped through the boards like a whisper he couldn't quite catch. And he sat at the table, 2 untouched cups of coffee. Before him, the second chair cleaned, waiting. Still empty, but the face in his mind wasn't his daughter's, wasn't his wife's. It was a pair of hollow eyes behind iron bars, surrounded by people who no longer knew the difference between laughter and a cry for help. There was something in that gaze, unspoken but familiar as his own face in the mirror at first light. Maybe someone was still alive, but had nowhere left to stand without something being pulled out of them. Maybe the second chair still needed keeping, not for someone who was lost, but for someone who'd never been held at all. At first light, dew still clung to the wooden planks of the horse stall. Wyatt was up before the sun, like always, but this morning he didn't brew 2 cups of coffee. He brewed 1. The other cup he tucked into a cloth satchel, alongside a leftover piece of cornbread from the day before, a few old leather straps, and a small, dull-bladed knife. He didn't tell anyone, didn't speak a word to Rye. The horse just looked at him, as if she already knew. He returned to town just as the sun was cresting the edge of the world. The townsfolk still slept in the musk of liquor and snoring lungs, but the circus did not. They were packing. The iron cage had been draped with canvas, ready to be hauled away. A heavy-set man was chaining an old bear to the wagon, cigarette hanging from his lip. Wyatt said nothing. He tied Rye to a wooden post, then walked straight to the cage. The girl was still there, curled up just like the night before, her hands still loosely bound, her eyes still absent of plea. The man chuckled when he saw Wyatt. "You want her for the night? $2? No haggling." Wyatt didn't look at him. He simply knelt, pulled the knife from his satchel, and began cutting through the rope at the cage door. The blade wasn't sharp, but he worked through each strand in silence. No rush, no anger, as though this was the only thing in the world he was certain needed doing. The man lunged forward, grabbing Wyatt's wrist. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Wyatt looked up. His earth-colored eyes met the sneer of the trafficker. There was no punch, no shouting, just a look, direct, deep, and uninvited. The look of a man who'd buried his own with bare hands. The look of someone who'd lost everything and was still here. The man stepped back. He cursed under his breath, but didn't stop him. Wyatt opened the door, and he didn't reach out, didn't call her name. He simply stepped back, 3 paces, and stood still, regarding her not as a thing to be claimed, but as an equal, free to choose. She didn't move, but after a long, long moment she lifted her head. Her eyes were swollen, but they could still catch the light of morning. Her chest rose and fell as if she couldn't believe she was breathing air without bars. Her hands trembled as they touched the rusted iron, and then one step, just one step, carried her out of the shadows. No one applauded, no one spoke her name. Only the breeze moved gently through the old buildings, fluttering the faded prayer flags strung between them. A stray dog barked somewhere far off, and there were footsteps, soft, light, the sound of someone who had forgotten they were allowed to stand tall in the world. Wyatt turned. He didn't ask her to follow, didn't ask her to stay. But when he mounted Rye and turned the horse toward the edge of town, there were footsteps behind him, close enough to hear, far enough not to startle. He didn't look back, but from his bag he pulled the piece of cornbread, broke it in half, and dropped one piece to the earth without a glance. The girl bent down, picked it up, looked at the bread, then looked at his back, riding away. And for the first time in years, she chose to walk toward someone without being dragged, without being chained. The road back to the ranch was a strip of red dust winding through sunburnt hills. Rye walked slowly, sometimes pausing as if waiting. But Wyatt said nothing. He kept his pace steady, quiet, as though this whole stretch of land had nothing left but the sound of hooves striking stone and the wind breathing through dry cactus and brittle grass. The girl followed behind, 5 paces or so. No one gave orders, no one asked questions. When the noon shadows lengthened, Wyatt stopped near a rock cleft where water seeped through. He dismounted, removed the saddle, poured some water into an old tin cup, and placed it before Rye. The horse drank. Then he filled a second cup and set it down about an arm's reach away. This time he didn't turn to look at the girl. She stood still. Sunlight struck her face hard. A blackbird cut across the sky, its shadow slicing the stone like a thin blade. She stepped forward, slow, and knelt to drink. The first drops burned her throat from too many dry days. She coughed, then covered her mouth, as if afraid the sound alone might earn her exile. Wyatt simply placed the cup on the earth, said nothing. A minute later, he reached into a saddle pouch, pulled out a sack of dried beans, and held it toward her, not in a way that demanded she take it. He just laid it on a flat, clean stone, close enough not to feel forgotten, far enough not to feel forced. She sat, didn't eat right away. Her hands trembled as she opened the bag. She picked out a few beans, chewed slowly. Her eyes didn't meet his, but they no longer stared at the dirt. That afternoon, they walked on. By the time they reached the old valley road where time had left its teeth in jagged stones along the path, clouds had rolled in. The wind turned cold. She coughed once, then again and again. Her breath rose like dust from dry earth. Wyatt didn't speak. He simply stopped, pulled off the coarse wool scarf from around his neck, and laid it over the back of the saddle where she could reach it. Then he turned away, adjusting the reins as if no one was watching. She picked up the scarf. Her hands shook, but she didn't refuse. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was falling fast. The small cabin with its rusted tin roof stood alone among scorched cotton fields. The wind rattled the door. The chicken coop sat empty. A yellow cat leapt off the brick step, eyeing them with suspicion. Wyatt dismounted, tied Rye to the same wooden post as always. The girl stood still, uncertain where to go. Wyatt didn't motion, didn't invite. He stepped onto the porch, pushed open the door, then stepped aside. He left the doorway open, not as a command, not as permission, but as a question that didn't need to be answered. She looked at the threshold like a place she had once imagined but never dared enter. And finally she climbed the steps, slowly, one at a time. When her bare foot touched the cold wooden floor inside, the creak that followed sounded like the start of another life. Wyatt stepped in behind her. He didn't ask her name, didn't lay down conditions. He just poured 2 cups of water. One for himself. The other he placed at the far edge of the table, near where she sat, still unsure if she was allowed to stay. That night he built a fire with cottonwood kindling. In the flickering light, the bruises on her face cast deeper shadows. No one asked where the other came from. Only the pop of the fire, the wind slipping through the cracks, and a house that had long known silence now held another person. Wordless, but warm enough to change the air inside. For the first time she slept on bare wooden floorboards, not tied down, not chased off, not needing to look at anyone for permission, only the wind, and a man who never tried to save her, only left the door open. The next morning, before sunlight crested the ridge, Wyatt was already up. He raked the yard, checked the woodpile by the cattle shed. The routines of a man who'd lived alone too long. Repeated, precise, with no wasted motion. The girl was no longer curled beside the hearth. The kitchen door hung slightly open. On the table sat a wooden bowl, empty but clean. Wyatt stepped into the kitchen. On the stove, water was boiling in an old tin pot. No one had seen who started the fire, but it was clear she had done it, not out of obligation, but by choice. Through the window he saw her in the garden, standing among the wilted onions, in her hand a dull little knife, pulling weeds from between the rows. Her movements were clumsy, unsure, as if it was the first time she'd ever touched the earth with her hands unbound. She didn't glance toward the house, but she stayed. Wyatt said nothing. That evening he poured 2 cups of water again, but this time he placed 2 bowls and ladled bean stew into each. When he set the bowl in front of her, she looked up for a brief second. It wasn't a long look, but it didn't flinch. Something flickered in her eyes, like someone who'd spent a long time living in a world full of sound no one ever bothered to hear. On the 3rd day, Wyatt left an old dress, his wife's, hanging on the door of the bathhouse outside. No explanation, no pressure. That evening, when the girl came inside, the dress had been changed. It didn't fit. It wasn't pretty, but it was clean. Her hair had been pulled back, clumsily, but neat. He saw, but said nothing. On the 4th day, Wyatt returned from plowing the southern field and noticed a broom propped just behind the door. She was sitting cross-legged in the yard, watching ants weave across the brick path. He passed by her in silence. Until he dropped an old horseshoe from the saddle. The metallic thud rang out sharp and dry. She turned quickly, and for the first time, Wyatt heard her voice. Not a full sentence, just 2 words. It's yours. She stepped closer than usual and handed it to him. the wind lifted a lock of hair across her cheek, revealing a small scar near her temple. It wasn't clear if it came from a fall or someone's hand. Wyatt took the horseshoe, didn't thank her, just looked at her directly without pity. For the first time, she didn't lower her head. That night, Wyatt lit the fire as he always did, but this time he didn't make coffee for one. He placed 2 mugs on the wooden table. When he brought the kettle out, he didn't pour into his cup first. He set it in the center and waited. She walked over, didn't speak, just picked up the kettle, poured half a mug for him, then half for herself. For the first time, they drank at the same time. No one smiled, no one asked anything, but in that small wooden house there was suddenly a sound that hadn't been there before. Not fire, not wind, presence. That night, Wyatt sat outside, splitting kindling. She came and stood beside him. After a long moment, she said, "It's not that I couldn't hear." Then paused. Wyatt didn't press. She added, voice soft as wind through dry grass, "I just didn't want to speak to them." Then she walked back inside, lightly, as if she herself wasn't sure she'd truly said anything at all. Wyatt kept splitting wood. His hands struck the log with weight. He didn't smile, but they didn't tremble anymore. Wyatt rose earlier than usual. The wind came in from the west, carrying the scorched scent of beaten earth, a mixture of dust and ash from somewhere out in the valley. That kind of wind always reminded him of the old days, when land laws in Gully's Hollow were twisted by speculators from Galena who drove out the native people to turn prairie into short-lived gold camps. Men like that left behind chaos, and men like Gideon who made a living picking through the wreckage. At the hilltop, where the ground turned to gravel, Wyatt stood in silence. Off in the distance, a thin column of smoke rose into the ash-colored sky beside a blackened ring of stones, the kind of fire no villager lit. Only one kind of person built a fire like that. Trackers. He didn't head home right away. Before leaving the slope, he drew the knife from his saddle and stabbed it into the dry trunk of a mesquite tree, carving a single slash across the bark. A sign for himself. Back at the ranch, the girl was hanging damp cloth in the sun. Her hair was tied in a knot behind her neck, hiding the scar. Wyatt passed by without a word, without a lingering glance. But in the barn, he dug through the old straw beneath the feed trough. A worn leather pouch surfaced. Agua. Inside it, a small revolver, a few dulled rounds, and a sheet of paper wrapped in twine, browned with age. A letter. In a slanted hand, it read, "Don't let them take again." He didn't reread it, just checked the bullets, then tucked the gun back with care. That evening the cold came early. The wind carried the sound of distant hoofbeats, which stopped suddenly beyond the tree line. The girl sat near the hearth, weaving strips of fabric, silent, but her eyes strayed toward the window, as if something in the air was familiar to her. Wyatt lit the fire, not with ordinary kindling, but with dry oak, the kind that burned slow and sent black smoke high into the sky, a signal to anyone watching from a distance. He knew. Men like Gideon, who'd once trafficked flesh through towns like Galena, never traveled alone. Gideon, the man with the silver ring marked Galena on his thumb, a leftover of his time working for land grabbers, always left deeper tracks than most. Late that night, Wyatt sat on the porch, the gun resting by his boot, his eyes unblinking. A scrap of paper blew across the yard, scrawled in jagged writing, "Colton, girl, runaway." He picked it up, burned it in the ashes of the stove. The girl didn't see. At dawn, the hoofbeats grew near. Hard to tell how many horses, but the rhythm was heavy. Not village folk. Wyatt placed his hand on the gun, didn't rise. The girl sat behind the door in the dark. Then silence. The hoofbeats faded. No one knocked. But in the dust before the porch there were footprints, deep iron-nailed boots. Beside them a snapped branch, left like a warning. Wyatt buried. The broken limb in the hearth's ashes said nothing to the girl. Morning arrived, slow. Sunlight filtered through a thin veil of cloud, casting a soft glow on the last wisps of smoke from the stove. Ida stood by the window, her hand clenched around the frayed edge of her scarf, eyes locked on a distant point, as if she could hear hoofbeats riding in from old memories. Wyatt stepped out into the yard, his hand resting on the axe leaned against the post. He didn't look at her, didn't ask. But when she gave the slightest nod, he knew. She'd seen him. The rider appeared by noon. He circled the cypress grove twice, slow like a hound catching scent. A black hat with worn silver trim shaded his face. A dust-covered leather coat draped over his shoulders. Gideon, the same man who once worked for the flesh trade out of Galena, in the days when native people were driven off their land after blood-soaked legal disputes. The silver ring carved with Galena glinted on his thumb, a reminder of sins he never shed. He tied his horse to the stall, drank from the trough, then knocked twice on the side of the feed barrel. A slow, deliberate rhythm. Inside, Ada froze. Her hands trembled, but not from the cold. Gideon spoke, loud enough to be heard through the cracked door. She heard real good this one. Every time I threw the chain, she flinched like a cornered animal. A dry laugh followed. He pulled a short rope from his coat pocket, a knot tied at one end, the mark of the auctions she'd once been dragged through. Fools thought she was deaf, but I knew she wasn't, and she knows I knew. Wyatt stepped out, stood between the threshold and the light, and looked at Gideon the way one might look at a ghost. Something no longer human. "What do you want?" Wyatt asked. Gideon smirked. "What I left behind. She carries what belongs to me, memories, and I won't let anyone else keep what's mine." Wyatt pointed down the dusty trail. "You leave. I don't bury men in the fields." Gideon let out a laugh that scraped like broken glass. "No need. But, they'll come. The ones who paid to watch her in that cage. They don't forget." He tossed the rope to the ground, turned his back, and disappeared into the woods, leaving behind the stench of tar and tobacco. That evening Wyatt packed more straw into the granary, locked the barn gate with a chain and steel clasp. Under the floorboards he placed 2 guns, one his own, the other smaller, cleaned and ready. Etta said nothing, but she knew. She stepped into the kitchen, took out 2 porcelain cups, poured hot water into both, and slid one across the table toward him. 3 days later, the wind didn't come, nor the birds. Even the horses in the stable stood still as stone, no shuffling, no restless snorts. Wyatt knew. Animals always sensed things before men did. He stood on the porch, hand resting on the old axe, leaned against the post, not to use, just to feel something solid, something heavy and real in the middle of a midday that felt eerily wrong. The girl didn't ask. She gathered dry wood, topped off the water barrel, checked the bolts behind the doors. For the first time in her life, she moved like someone who'd learned this from someone else, though no one had ever taught her. Wyatt glanced over, said nothing, but the way she wedged a stone against the side door like an old habit. He knew. She understood. Near dusk they came. No fanfare, no warning shots. Just the sound of bridles tapping metal, clink, clink, enough to make the crows abandon their nests before any man heard it. 3 horses, 4 men, a small cart hitched behind them, covered with canvas, no flag, no signs, but one of them wore a silver hook in place of a finger, a mark Wyatt had heard about from someone who'd once escaped the auctions in Galena. They didn't look around. They knew she was here, and they weren't here to bargain. Wyatt didn't meet them at the gate. He closed the door to the house, didn't bar it, only said, quiet, "I never told you she was deaf, but you believed it anyway." One of them, the one with the hook, walked up and kicked over the porch chair. The wood cracked as it hit the ground. Not loud enough to intimidate, but enough to say, "Peace once lived here." "I came to take back what used to be mine," the man said. Wyatt let out a dry laugh. His eyes never left the man's chest. "Horse? Gun? Or your pride?" No answer. They moved forward. Inside, the girl still stood by the stove. Her hands did not shake. She opened the drawer beneath the table and took out a pistol, old but oiled clean, day by day. She didn't cock it, didn't raise it, just held it, the way one holds a memory they thought they'd already thrown away. Outside, Wyatt stepped off the porch. Not fast, not backing down. Between him and them, there was no fence, just dry earth and wind stirring at their feet. One of the men pulled the trigger. Click. Empty. Wyatt smirked. "Try again." The air was tight as a drawn rein on a wild horse. The hook-fingered man stepped closer. His eyes locked on Wyatt, but his lips twitched, as though seeing through him toward the window behind. "You know I don't need words," he said. "I only need to take her. You can stay alive." Wyatt answered like telling a story he'd told himself 100 times. "Once I found a dog with its tail hacked off. Every time someone passed by, it bit. Not 'cause it was mean, just didn't know any other way to keep from disappearing. And I shot it." Pause. Then crash, not gunfire, but the stable gate collapsing. One of the intruder's horses, panicked, snapped its reins, knocked over a feed barrel. Dust exploded into the air. One man lost his footing, fell. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He surged forward, no gun, just the force of a man who'd chopped trees through 4 hard winters. He slammed his shoulder into the nearest one, ripped the pistol from his grip, turned. Fast. A shot rang out, but not from Wyatt, from inside the house. The girl, she hadn't aimed. She just fired instinctively at the blur of movement behind the window frame. She hit nothing, but it was enough to make the men stagger, not from fear, but from confusion. By the time they found their bearings, Wyatt was standing square on the porch. The girl stood behind him, again between them, a weathered wooden table with 2 cups of water, still steaming. That night no one slept, not from fear, but because the wooden house held its breath, as if daring to close their eyes might summon those men back, not on horseback this time, but in flame. Wyatt sat on the porch, his back resting against the wall, a gun across his lap, his eyes fixed on the flickering lamplight in the valley below. Inside, the girl wiped ash from her hands, then carefully placed the pistol, still unfired, into the wooden drawer. She did it gently, as though setting down something sacred, not because it had saved her life, but because it had marked the first time she had defended it. At first light, a rider arrived. No badge, no uniform, only a letter sealed with the wax crest of the Elkhorn Circuit Court. "There's been a complaint," he read aloud. "Says Mr. Boone is harboring an undocumented girl. No family, no papers, and no permit to work." The messenger didn't ask questions, just read, but his eyes betrayed the contempt he carried. Not for Wyatt, but for the girl watching from behind the door. "I'm to bring her in for identification and questioning." Wyatt didn't answer. He stepped inside, returned with a small, worn leather pouch, and withdrew a creased piece of paper, signed by an old judge who still owed Wyatt a favor from a winter wildfire long ago. "This paper gives me the right to shelter those with nowhere else to go." "Only for 30 days, Mr. Boone. Today is day 31. The messenger nodded. No threats, no force. But he placed a folded notice on the table before riding off. A summons, Not because Wyatt had broken a law, but because he refused to turn over someone the state had not yet decided was human. The girl stood beside the table, her eyes fixed on the red wax seal. She didn't speak. Wyatt looked at her, slow, steady, then sat down, as he always did, and poured 2 cups of water. One for him, one for her. "I don't have the right to keep you," he said, "but I don't have the right to hand you over either." She sat, and for the first time she was the one to lift her cup first. No thank you, no tears, just one sip, as if that act alone was her quiet declaration to keep living. That evening they cleared out the back room. Once a flower store, now it would be her space, separate as the law required. Wyatt repaired the old door with boards half-eaten by time, but he didn't seal it tight. He left it slightly ajar, unlocked, unlatched, and he said, "If you leave, I won't stop you. But if you stay, I'll build another table and a chair." That night, she carved her name into a scrap of wood. Ada. No one had taught her to write, but somehow she remembered. 2 days later, the sound of hooves clattered faintly down the red dirt slope. The wagon reached the ranch gate before the sun could clear the tops of the trees. No dust stirred, no shouts, just the creaking of wooden wheels pulling a burden heavier than cargo. A decision made. Wyatt didn't come to meet it. Ada stood behind the old curtain, eyes steady on the path ahead. Her heart didn't beat faster, not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear had become an old habit, like hunger or cold. The wagon stopped. A middle-aged woman stepped down, black dress, gloves. She didn't look around. This was Mrs. Eleanor Grant, deputy mayor of Dustwell, a woman who carried both the law and the judgment of the town. "I hear you're keeping a girl here," she said. Wyatt nodded. "She's a person. She's a complaint." Mrs. Grant stepped into the house without waiting for an invitation. She said nothing more, only looked around like a hound sniffing out crime in the grain of the walls. Ada didn't hide. She stepped forward on bare feet, wearing the gray dress Wyatt had mended twice, hands still dusted with flour. She'd been making bread since morning. "What's your name?" Mrs. Grant asked, her voice cold as winter earth. "Ida." "Surname?" Silence. Mrs. Grant exhaled, not in contempt, but in confirmation. "You have no surname, no birth record, no guardian, no reason to be here. What do you have to prove you're not a fugitive?" Ada met her gaze, said nothing, but she lifted her hand, the left, and showed the round scar still visible on the flesh, an old cut, a mark of ownership, branded on her long ago by someone who'd treated her like livestock. Wyatt stood silent. Mrs. Grant touched the scar, then let go. "So you belonged to someone once?" Ada nodded. "Not anymore." "Yes," Mrs. Grant echoed softly. "Not anymore." A long silence followed, a space between the human heart and the law. Mrs. Grant turned toward the door, but didn't leave right away. "If she stays," she said, "you'll bring her before the town council every month. She'll have to learn to read, to sign her name, to answer the questions asked of her. If not, others will come, and they won't be carrying paper and ink." Etta didn't move. Mrs. Grant looked back once more. "Your door is always open, isn't it?" Wyatt didn't answer, just nodded. When the wagon disappeared behind the shrubs, Etta turned back into the house, and for the first time she closed the door that had always been left open. Not locked, just closed. That afternoon she sat at the table, opened a notebook Wyatt had found in an old trunk, took a broken pencil in her unsteady hand and wrote, "My name is Ida. I am alive." The August rain came without warning. The frail wooden house groaned under the weight of it, thick drops hitting like stones, and out beyond, the fields, the wind howled through the valley like voices calling each other from a distance no one dared to turn toward. Wyatt slept in the armchair. The lamp was out. The fire still glowed, low and steady. Ida stood silently by the cupboard, where she'd placed the clean shoes, a folded note, and a small handkerchief she had stitched for him after he cut himself splitting wood that first week. She didn't cry, just slipped on the old wool sweater, his sweater, and walked out the back door. She left no words, only left herself behind. The version of her that had learned to bake bread, fold blankets smooth, brew tea at the right hour, and stand by a fire without trembling. She followed the creek, heading toward the valley. Each step was a tightening of the lips, each breath a question. Do I belong here, or am I just borrowing kindness from a man who never learned how to say no? She had never been given a choice, and now having one was the most frightening thing of all. Just before dawn, the rain let up. Ida sat beside a stone, soaked to the skin, but not shivering. She stared off toward Dustwell, where Eleanor Grant had once called her a complaint. Etta didn't know where she meant to go, only that she was afraid to stay, as though Wyatt's kindness were too large a gift, and she didn't deserve to carry it. Behind her came the sound of hooves. Not urgent, just one horse, slow, steady, no shouting, no name called, only drawing near and stopping a few steps away. Ida didn't turn. Wyatt didn't dismount. The wind passed between them, no words. An owl swept across the sky. The breeze tangled her hair, but her hand stayed clenched around the note in her pocket. If you leave, you'll leave all that's good behind, but if you stay, will you ruin it? Wyatt dipped his head as if to check the sky. Then, after a moment, he tossed down a heavy coat, the old hunting jacket he'd worn his first winter at the ranch. The cold'll come before the sun does, and with that he turned his horse, crossed the far side of the creek. No questions, no demands, no call to return, just the laying down of one more layer between her and the wind. She sat there until the sun broke through, the paper in her hand blurred from rain and tears. Finally, she rose, took the coat, turned her back to the town, and walked slowly toward the wooden house whose door had never been locked. When she arrived, Wyatt was leaning against the doorframe, drinking tea. No questions, no rebuke. He simply nudged aside a small chair, set the teapot on the old table, and said, "Tea's still warm." Etta sat down, and for the first time in her life, she felt she wasn't someone being allowed to stay, but someone who had been invited. Autumn crept into Gully's Hollow in drafts that slipped through cracks in the wallboards. Wyatt rose early, and something in the air felt off. He wasn't a suspicious man by nature, but the instincts of someone who'd survived the land wars of Galena had taught him to never ignore the scent of ash, carried by the wind. The windows fogged with breath. Smoke from the stove curled straight into the morning sky. Ida was scrubbing the porch, sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back with a faded silver ribbon. Since her return, she bowed her head less, walked through doorways without flinching. She cleaned the house with such care, not even a speck of dust dared remain. Wyatt said nothing, just pulled a chair out to the porch and sat, so she'd know someone was listening to the sound of her broom. That morning, while taking the hammer out to repair the goat pen fence, Wyatt noticed footprints in the dirt. Fresh, heavy-soled, iron-nailed boots. Not his, not Ida's. He went inside, retrieved the rifle from beside the hearth, and hid it from her eyes. By late afternoon, Etta was gathering mint leaves behind the house when she heard a rustle from the brush. Then a muffled cough. She froze, the leaves falling from her hand. Then came the voice, sharp as cut wire. "You remember my voice, don't you, Ida?" "I know you do." Gideon stepped out, gray shirt, patchy stubble, eyes sharp like broken glass. The silver ring engraved with Galena flashed in the light. A mark from his years with the land grabbers, those who trafficked flesh when native families were being pushed from their homes. He pulled from his pocket an old rope, the end tied into a familiar knot. The same knot once used to bind Ida's wrists, back when she lived in a cage. She stepped back until her hand met the stone wall of the outdoor oven. Gideon raised both palms. No weapon. "I'm not here to hurt you, just to talk. You never thanked the man who pulled you out of the trash heap, did you?" Click, the sound of metal. Wyatt stood at the edge of the yard, rifle aimed square at Gideon's chest, eyes cold as frozen lake water. Ida couldn't speak, couldn't move. Gideon gave a low, dry laugh. "You think you understand her, old man? She's the stain that clings to every town I've passed through." He tossed the rope to the ground, then turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving behind the bitter stench of tarred tobacco, a scent Ida had once hoped she'd forgotten since the year she turned 16. That night, for the first time, Wyatt bolted the door. He laid the rifle across the dining table, then sat in silence before the fire, weighing whether to leave or to stay. This time, not alone. Etta brewed tea and set the cup before him. Then she sat in the chair to his left. They spoke no words into the night, but both knew. Peace had just made its first sound breaking. The next morning the valley was draped in a fine layer of mist, a shroud quiet as a burial cloth for nights that had already passed. Gully's hollow held its breath, no birds, no wind rattling the tin roof. Wyatt rose early, but he didn't brew coffee as he always did, didn't mend fences or stir the fire. He stood on the porch, gazing toward the forest, where yesterday an old shadow had disappeared into the trees. Then he sat in the wooden chair, an empty cup in hand, not because there was no coffee, but because he was waiting for someone else to pour the first time. Ida was no longer in the kitchen. No clinking of bowls, no apron hung by the door. Wyatt stepped into her room, empty, the blanket folded neat, the old gray ribbon laid across the pillow, and on the table a slip of paper, slanted handwriting. "I once thought I was made to bow my head, but because of you, I know I can turn it back and choose to stay. I'm down at the creek. Today I want to wash away a name someone else gave me." Wyatt didn't call out, didn't chase. He pulled on his coat, walked to the barn, and took with him a simple earth-colored scarf, the one Ida had once said she'd save for a special day, at the bend where the creek slipped between the stones. Beneath the leaning oak that stood like a quiet sentinel, Etta stood alone. She had taken off her old dress, letting it drift down the stream. Now she wore only a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled up, hair unbound, and for the first time she lifted water to her face and shoulders, not to cleanse the dirt, but to wash off voices that once taught her to lower her gaze. The sound of hooves came behind her, slow and steady. She didn't turn. She simply said, "I'm not leaving again." Wyatt dismounted, said nothing, just handed her the scarf. She took it, slowly wrapped it around her hair, and looked him in the eyes, no longer someone who had been sold, but someone who had chosen to live. Together they returned to the cabin by noon. No one asked where the other had been. No one spoke of yesterday. Ada lit the stove. Wyatt split wood. They made first harvest bean stew, shared it in 2 bowls, each in their own chair. The back door stayed open. No one pulled it shut. That evening Wyatt placed the second cup of coffee on the table. This time Ida reached for it and drank. No need for grand endings, no need for declarations of change, just one who didn't leave, one who was allowed to return, and a porch wide enough for 2 shadows no longer afraid of the night wind.